some really good stuff going on. So my name's James Gillies. I'm a senior automation consultant, technology consultancy. I work for a company called Xenaxis, focusing on automation in a number of areas, mainly so both automation of the RPA and process automation for business processes, and using automation tools there to increase efficiencies and sort of standard stuff that and I was talking about earlier. And what we're going to look at today more is the test automation side of things. There's actually quite a lot of common threads and common aspects and ways of doing things across both of those areas. Quite a lot of crossover. So I've basically spent far too many years working in technical delivery, also worked in service transition and service management. So I kind of had the experience of seeing both sides of what happens with good and bad testing, and spent a part of my life being the gatekeeper, saying, okay, have you actually tested what you said you were going to test, and have you looked at all the security sides of it, and have you got the right scope coverage and so on. So what I thought I'd do today, we've had a lot of presentations looking at aspects, the more technical aspects of it, and sort of using the frameworks like Easy Repro, SpecFlow, and the RPA tools. I noted the it can all get a bit over immersive earlier, so I'm aiming to sort of step back a bit and kind of zoom out and look at more of the why and context of auto testing, and why you'd want to look at that for Dynamics and Power Apps in particular, in sort of context of wider testing. So I think we've got a fair number of people come back in now. So I reckon I could probably skip on to the next slide. So I'll kick off with this one, testing of Dynamics 365 and Power Apps. Why would you actually want to test these? I mean, particularly Dynamics, doesn't Microsoft already do all the testing for you? Challenges, one of the obvious challenges we've had with clients. Power Apps, probably a bit more obvious because you're building them yourself. But again, the whole spin is sort of no code and low code. But actually that shouldn't mean don't test it. And there's a number of reasons you'd want to sort of focus on automation, or on UI testing, and then we'll go into automation. New entities and forms within the data model, in the dataverse, new fields and attributes adding in there, do they behave properly? A big one we encounter is companies adding value with new PCF controls, sort of bank links, direct debit, that kind of stuff, things that hook into more complex technology in the back end, and they're potentially using those PCF controls in multiple solutions. So we need to validate that they behave properly and then they integrate into the workflows. Business rules obviously can change the way that the UI works, or even further, JavaScript, showing and hiding fields, locking entry, and so on. Security roles can be tweaked and use plugins. So it's basically, yes, there's a core platform, particularly with Dynamics, and it's a very rich functional platform. But actually, there's an awful lot of the benefit of Dynamics and the value that different companies bring to it is the expansion and the additional capabilities, and that does need testing. And a lot of it, because it's a very graphical and rich application, you need to think like the user, rather than just doing some number crunching under the covers. It's not just a calculation engine. So there's a lot about user experience. Next part, end-to-end testing. So actually Dynamics in particular will often sit within an overall business architecture. You'll have upstream systems, potentially Power Apps in the field integrating into the dataverse, and then downstream systems maybe for fulfilling orders in a factory or something coming out of the Power Platform. You have Power BI integrated with it and what have you. So if you think wider than Dynamics itself, it makes sense to be able to look at your entire business process and run data through from end to end. And actually what you find then is, as well as testing interfaces between systems, if you actually prepare the data and get the data right and start and make yourself, if you bring that forward, you think through that, actually it can be quite a benefit in supporting the development cycle, because you've actually got some realistic data to work with when prototyping. And obviously regression testing with the continual rolling releases of the waves, just to make sure that customizations work. And then the third large chunk is performance or scenario testing, because once you've got automated UI tests, you can actually start to drive load testing. Less of an issue with the SaaS cloud than it used to be with on-premise or sort of your own managed infrastructure, even in the cloud. But it's still worth testing responsiveness of the UI, just making sure that's reasonable and you haven't built something that just takes forever in JavaScript. Validating security roles and access to data, that's a good one. Running multiple, acting as multiple users, checking people can see the right thing, they can't see the wrong thing. And basically, driving the UI as different personas. So that's kind of a overview of why you'd want to look at UI testing of Dynamics and Power Apps in particular. And I think it's not dissimilar to what you'd find with most applications. But like I said, there can be some pushback from clients in that they think they're buying an off-the-shelf solution, even when they've really asked for quite a lot of customization. So stepping on to the next slide, that's kind of an introductory slide. So quite a lot of bullets on this one, but we're not going to go through all of it in detail. So basically, I kind of came up with did a bit of a search around and talked to some people and came up with, it was 15, but then it became 16 because that's a nice hexadecimal type number. Best practices to think about when you're planning and designing UI tests. The first point we sort of talked about already, covered on the last slide to some degree, using UI testing as a component in a wider framework. So if you're working with back-end systems, even mainframes, databases in the mix and messaging systems, you'll want to be able to sort of have an overall test framework that can deal with APIs and database queries as well, and tie together what's happening with the data in sort of different parts of the flow. So you'd have a website, maybe a third-party website that does something up front, foreign exchange trading stuff we encounter in financial services, things like that, and that could feed down into Dynamics platform or Power Apps, and you basically want to trace the data through. But you also obviously you need to do performance testing, you need to test calculation engines. UI testing, you probably wouldn't want to do massive exercises of do all the calculations work. I mean, you could, but it would probably be a bit less efficient. Than that's when you sort of go into more traditional system testing and throw all the various complicated calculations at the system under the covers and check that the right results come out at the other end. Adopting a risk-based approach to testing. I think most people have heard of the 80-20 rule. There's some aspects of that basically says for 80%, you can get 80% of the coverage with 20% of the effort, but then actually the last 20% takes the other 80%, and it's really difficult. Actually, so look at the use cases, look at the test, the sort of the data, look at use cases, look at what your users are going to do. If you've got analytics about what people do within systems, that's brilliant. You can sort of start focusing things with that. Basically, look at the stuff, aim to focus at first on the stuff that's most at risk or most visible, and then you can build out a framework, but don't try and boil the ocean up front. The next two, we will look at some more detail in another slide. So basically, there's a couple of related points here. So don't try and automate everything. Some things actually should need to be manually tested. I'll have a look at that later. But some things lend themselves absolutely to automation, and it can be quite easy to tangle up and just decide you want to automate everything because it's brilliant and it's great and it's modern and whizzy. Actually, just sort of take a bit of a balanced view, and then also when to automate. I'm sure everyone's experienced the thing where, okay, well, we think we've got the user interface done, but then the users keep changing their minds, and then we've got to move controls around and all the rules change. And if you actually build the tests, the automated tests too early, you end up essentially in a continual churn of revising those as you're working, and it breaks the efficiency. So that then neatly flows into the next one, which is consider using a BDD framework. So I was watching a couple of the presentations earlier, and BDD came up in David's and I think it was Ankit's. It's a business-driven development, test-driven development, very similar concepts. Essentially, think through what your use cases are going to be, and think through what the data would be needed for those and what's going to happen. And then you can actually sort of sketch out the test cases alongside the use cases. And we saw the Gherkin descriptions earlier. It's sort of when I'm here, I want to be able to do this, and then if I do this, something else should happen, and then you sort of check it. And that's actually a very useful framework, and test tools that support Gherkin are quite valuable. And that, once you've got that set out, you can then later use that to drive your automation once you've got everything settled. But even with those, the detail of what's where and exactly how something works isn't necessarily captured in the Gherkin. So as we saw earlier, the underlying scripts need to handle that. Don't run all tests across all target browsers. I mean, we tend to use Chrome or New Edge most of the time because of the Chromium underpinnings. They work very well with Selenium WebDrivers. But if you've got a mix of browsers, mix and match the tests across them, because it sort of spreads things out and makes it more likely you'll find issues. Make the automation framework environment dependent. Certainly saw some of the examples of that earlier with environment variables being brought into the tests. Basically, you want a framework that you can just say, I'm going to stand up another sandpit, give it a set of configuration variables, and point the test framework at that, and it will quite happily run against a different test framework. Fits nicely into the DevOps pipeline setup as well. Structure and name your tests wisely, right in the middle. Obviously, coming back to if you're building regression test packs out of this stuff, ultimately, you need to be able to work out what's going on. So give them descriptive names, structure it, proper hierarchies, and so on. Really just improves maintainability and helps with documentation. One thing we'll look at was developing tests around user journeys. So that's looking at how users use the system, and basically thinking as a user and working through their flows that the users will have. So I'll come back to that in a bit more detail later. Try and make tests simple and also reuse parts of them as components. So if you've got a test to search for something, actually, or navigate to a different screen, or change the view in a grid, actually parameterize that and reuse that component, and it both makes development of the test more efficient, but it also just means you're continually exercising the same point. And it particularly means that if something breaks in that aspect, for example, something changes in the HTML for the search, you can fix it in one place ideally. Don't forget about keyboard shortcuts. Test different navigation methods. There's a lot of focus on sort of interacting with the controls with the sort of the mouse and so on, but test that the keyboard shortcuts do what they're supposed to. And sort of a corollary of the user journeys, look at using data-driven testing effectively. think through what data is needed. I sort of touched on that on the last slide, and what would exercise your system, or what will flow through, and try and make that really realistic. Look at negative as well, testing as well as positive. Try and break stuff. Ties in with the data driven, because if you've got a data engine, you can sort of generate an awful lot of essentially garbage test data to try and break stuff. But make sure you're not just testing the happy path. Try and keep test cases independent, so that you can sort of mix and match. If you're changing one particular area, or you've got a particular concern in one area of the system, you should be able to sort of build a sort of test pack that focuses there. It also lets you do things like sort of smoke tests for new environments. You can sort of pick tests from different areas of the system without having to run the entire suite. Particular focus for today, selecting the right tools for the job, for the scope and challenges. So we'll come back to that. And then set up detailed test reporting and auditing. So that's important for gathering the evidence, for convincing people like me in my previous role as a transition manager that your system is good to go for release. And for DevOps and CI/CD, you need to keep that as an audit requirement usually. So that's that slide. Have you got any questions in the meantime? As I go into a bit more of the detail. Cool. So next slide. What and when to automate? It's a think in different ways. So don't just automate everything as much as you can. There's benefits to both manual and automated testing, and we've got the friendly robot and the slightly grumpy person on the right with their very different perspectives, actually looking at the same thing. So this is where you need to sort of consider not just deterministic testing, but subjective, and whether things are usable and whether they look good and whether they make sense to the eye. So great, the automated testing could say, right, the validation works, buttons do what they meant to do, the pipeline numbers increase as you create an opportunity. That's all done. But actually, you might have made a complete mess of the screen layout, colors all over the place, and it just looks like a mess, but actually mechanically it works. So, and then obviously the robot's keen to get going on testing the new functionality, but actually it's not ready yet, as I sort of mentioned earlier. So you need to sort of decide when to start automation based on the user experience stabilizing. Think again, go back to the 80-20 rule and sort of think about risk-based testing to deliver the right value. And looking to the future, once you develop the automation tests, they become a key component of regression test packs. So actually, in my experience, particularly with agile development and so on, you don't want to automate too soon. You sort of start looking at automating, you build the tests, you define what the tests are going to be, and then you refine them, and the actual automation tends to come when things are stabilized. And after that, then you start building out the regression pack. And as you go through releases, you can add to that regression pack, and things will become more robust over time. But yes, as I said, you need to think about both aspects of this. Don't just go all in on automation, because it may not necessarily give you all of the answers about what your users are going to say. So users are still important. The user journeys, I mentioned this earlier. So it's sort of coming at the testing from a user-centric aspect. So Wikipedia defines a user journey as the experience a person has when interacting with something, and that's typically software. Which, I mean, that's pretty to the point. It's how the user interacts with the system, and it's basically what they do in their day-to-day job. And there'll be different aspects of that job using different systems. And it's important in UI testing because it lets us focus on the experience of a single person operating under a specific role or a persona. And you can think about, and basically you'll construct different actors in the system and different user journeys. and that can give us a clear view of how each of the different users of a system actually experience it. Because, for example, you'll have salespeople interacting with clients, creating new prospects and so on, creating contacts, booking meetings and so on. But you'll also have maybe some onboarding people in a completely different part of the business interacting with the same data, but they have a very different journey about it. And they'll be they'll be checking that sort of the right documentation's been received, and sort of, credit checks maybe have been done and stuff like that. And the different roles under the considerations, this starts hitting onto security or role-based access control, and essentially the fact that not only do different users have different journeys through different parts of the system, but actually they should be able to see different things and do different things. And one of the benefits of automated testing is being able to, essentially, you can define your tests to say, I want to be able to do this and this and this, and include negative testing in a flow, so to validate whether something can or can't be done. And then you can basically build a data matrix to feed it, which says, okay, this user has this role, and they should be able to do tasks X, Y, and Z, but maybe they shouldn't be able to do A, B, and C. And then you can essentially feed that matrix into your testing and loop through it and just run the tests as everyone with the different roles, and make sure that they've got the right access and that no one can do stuff they can't. And if you've got 4 eyes checks on certain changes and so on, maybe for issuing invoices, then make sure that hooks together as well. And that interacts, and the personas for the user journeys interact with the data model in sort of, they kind of intersections. In the users work across data entities, accounts, contacts, opportunities, orders, activities, and so on. But actually, those entities themselves have their own life cycle. So you need to sort of think about what state data needs to be in for a user journey to be able to move on, and make sure that systems are in the correct state at each point. And also actually how the different personas change both the data state that they'll see and how app functionality interacts with the data, because you might have, for example, some views hidden, some screens, some fields hidden with business rules for different users and so on. Like I said, the corollary for user journeys is test data. Good planning around test data could greatly improve an overall project's efficiency. And there's a lot of different strands to this. So mentioned earlier, actually, if you've thought through your test data in advance and you're building a solid set with sort of, you can think, well, okay, we're going to need a number of accounts, and then we'll have contacts against them, and you'll need opportunities, and that will interact with a system that places orders maybe, and it will feed out to a Power App in the field, and we need to be able to, they need to put some parts data in there or something. It lets developers actually do a better job in prototyping and working with the users, because they've got realistic data to work with. And it helps drive testing to the left by sort of finding UI, data model, and interface issues early, where actually, if you're thinking through the different types of data, you're more likely to hit errors and issues in interfaces and so on, and work out ways to handle those earlier rather than having to patch things up later. Related, again, it ensures field types and validation can be correct from the beginning. And as you're working through the development, think about more things that will go into the data and essentially start enriching the data set. I've worked on projects where you've got sort of 5 or 10 man teams just working on managing test data and distributing it around environments and maintaining it, which can be a little excessive, but it actually needs to be thought about seriously when doing all testing, and particularly sort of UI testing in a system like Dynamics with the Dataverse underneath it. Ideally, you want data to be self-cleaning, so actually you can I mean, you can just tear down and recreate an environment, or you could actually set it up so that if you know what the data is that's going in and you've got all that documented, it's either in a database or Excel or something like that, then you can actually flush it out at the end of the test and leave the test as it is. And actually, if you're looking at smoke testing production environments, new environments, that's quite valuable because it means you don't leave anything behind. Thinking about the data in advance clarifies the functionality and the life cycle and what you expect to happen. And it can also significantly increase the efficiency of role and security model testing. Good data set, solid basis for good performance testing. I mentioned that earlier again. Slightly less relevant with the SaaS setup, but still worth bearing in mind because there can be long-running workflows and so on. And a subtle one, think about how your data relates to time. So it shouldn't reflect a specific time, but you should be able to sort of position it dynamically, so it's either relative to an action or event. So you could actually have a set of data that is keyed around today or month end or what have you, and parameterize that, and the test tooling would then essentially read the parameterized data from the data source and sub in 31st of March or 30th of September or whatever, or today, or just a trade date. And that, there's a particular point around there with triggering workflows and time-based workflows. So actually coming back to designing things, how you would think about how to trigger workflows and what have you in different processes before you go too far in, because actually you still need to automate those. So that's a brief skim over test data. Now, so there are some particular challenges with the Power Platform, as Yoda might say. While it's an amazing platform and very rich and continually growing, there are some very specific challenges. What was the UCI is now just the universal interface, very fluid and scalable, but actually when you scale it, you can find that what looks like the same control, for example, the nav bar, completely changes the HTML under the covers. And the UI reacts to context and data. So you've got fields popping in and out with business rules and so on. And there are asynchronous UI processes running in the background. And I think most people will have seen where you sort of go to a view and maybe select a number of accounts, and then you notice, actually, hang on, the command bar just changed and some more buttons turned up. And actually, if you've got a system that doesn't know how to wait for those asynchronous parts of the engine, you can end up trying to press a button that's not there because your automation went too quickly. Related to that, workflows and integrations and the ability to sort of look at the other end of those, or wait for triggers that a workflow has finished. For example, if you wanted to go off and create an account in a back-end invoicing system, off creating an account, off approving an account in Dynamics. Core at the heart there is, I think everyone who's worked on the frameworks, Easy Repro and so on, will acknowledge there is a very complex and dynamic DOM underneath the UI of Dynamics and the Power Platform, and that makes it quite challenging for a lot of automation tools. Particularly, we've found that because the UI is kind of built of components, you need to sort of think in terms of building blocks like that, and it fits less to the static page model approach. You can do it, but it becomes less of a natural fit. The PCF, you've got all sorts of custom controls. We touched on why you'd want to test them earlier. But again, the great thing about the PCF is the controls are reusable. You can use them in Dynamics and in the Power Apps. So you can actually just build a sandpit application that is a very controlled environment, and plan to actually thoroughly exercise your control in there, and again, 80-20 rule, just when you're looking at it inside overall solutions like Dynamics, then you basically can just test that it fits in the flow and behaves correctly there without necessarily having to do the detailed automation of it in an environment where the context may change. A big one is it's becoming less of a problem. We found quite a challenge in the earlier days of the unified interface. Invisible changes under the covers, where the UI looks pretty much the same, but actually the HTML's changed, and it's changed in subtle ways. Elements have changed, attributes have changed, and so on. Particularly in the model-driven apps, obviously Dynamics being one of the pretty much the biggest model-driven app, that can break automation, and that is because actually when you look at pretty much all of the tooling around auto testing, automation of Dynamics and Power, it comes back ultimately to XPaths. Pretty much, however much they're abstracted. Everything's looking for XPaths, and there's an awful lot of I think there's a lot of XPath maintenance goes on in Easy Repro as well, to try and abstract some of those changes. But that then plays back into, you want a tool that lets you componentize tests. Way back to one of the 16 points. If you've got a navigation step and the navigation bars change, then you can fix that sort of functional unit, and all of your tests that use it will then work. Or if the search box on the grid changes, something under the covers. So that's where componentizing it and keeping an eye on things that change is very important. And you ideally want to have almost an object approach to this, but yeah, pretty much basic chunks of functional test components. Because if you have to change an XPath across 200 tests, even with a search and replace, that's not much fun. Model-driven versus canvas apps. Model-driven DOM, very different to the canvas apps. The canvas apps, I kind of find myself harking back to, show my age, in a Visual Basic development and naming controls and the way, because actually you need to sort of, if you think about how to name controls properly when you're building the canvas apps, it helps greatly in automation, because you can actually just grab the control names that you specified in the app designer. Kind of related to that, the different heritages of bits of Dynamics. CE, customer engagement, is all model driven, one DOM, and the different apps like sort of Sales Hub and so on work in a very similar way under the covers. But for example, Business Central is quite a different DOM, and I suspect that's from the old Navision heritage. And then you've got finance and operations as well. So actually you need to think about your scope, and which parts of Dynamics, which parts of Power you're going to want to test and to automate. And then obviously the rolling release of new features, which is where your regression testing comes into play. So it's a fantastic platform, but it does present a lot of challenges around automation of the UI. And I think that a lot of the sessions today have been sort of demonstrating ways to work around some of these challenges. But this is kind of trying to put into context why this is quite a difficult task, and why we have the different frameworks to actually make it viable for non-hardcore developers to actually build these tests. So I'll step on bringing all of that together, run through a test automation example of an end-to-end test. Basically, user journey, or you could argue a couple of user journeys involving multiple data entities. So the aim of this test is basically, so you have a user creating a new account. Actually, we'll create two accounts in Dynamics, demonstrating sort of reading from a data source. we'll go and grab one, and we'll link those two accounts together, one as a sub account of the other. We'll go and change one of them from a prospect to a customer, and then they go to the contact screen, and we'll book a new contact, and we'll hook that to the account, sort of showing the holistic, taking a holistic view of the data. Then, as part of the sales journey, we'll schedule a meeting to give a demo for the contact, and then we'll say that the meeting went well. And then we'll go and find the activity in the activities view, record some meeting notes, and close the activity, and just check that it shows up in the closed meeting view rather than the closed activities rather than open activities. And then we'll step on next part of the sales cycle. Off the back of the meeting, we'll have an opportunity. So we'll create an opportunity, we'll put the budget in there, we'll attach it to the contact and account that we created earlier. Again, looking at sort of holistic data and an end-to-end picture of the data. And we'll put an estimated revenue against that. And we should be able to see that in the dashboard. We'll then use the automated test to progress the opportunity through the stages of the opportunity lifecycle BPF before we close it as one, and then we'll go and check the dashboard again just to make sure that it's turned up as a closed opportunity. And things to think about throughout this are the test data in each part of it, whether the individual tests have passed or failed. You can grab screenshots, test evidence, actually test output, JUnit outputs to be sucked into CI/CD and Azure the DevOps pipeline. I think Wael's going to talk about how to do that practically later this afternoon. And the results, again, it will be the results are recorded to give an audit trail and assist with debugging, and to help flow control in your pipeline. For example, if so many X amount of tests failed, you might want, if X% passed, you might want to say, actually, that's okay, we'll go ahead with the build, but you might have some flagged as critical and it stops there. So you can sort of, based on the JUnit results, you can control your pipeline. So having said that, all right, 20 minutes left, so that should be pretty much on time. So what I'm going to do now is bring up I'll just put Orca on the screen. So this is Orca's basically a commercial automation toolkit that we work with a lot. It's got very strong RPA, data transformation and reconciliation features, which actually work very well for automated testing, because you can sort of manipulate the data, localize it to time and place, and reconcile. You can sort of read it from databases or Excel. I mean, I'll be using Excel here, and it's nice and graphical with drag and drop flow control, but you can write more complex sort of Java and Groovy code in it if you want, and it gives us some test reporting out of the back. So, and I have a framework we've developed for Dynamics and model-driven apps primarily. So what we'll do, this is a very high-level test, and essentially it will follow the process that we did I showed on the previous slide. We'll create the prospect accounts, change prospect to customer. Actually, let's quickly tweak that. So it's prospect accounts. We'll create the contact and book a meeting. We'll update and complete the meeting, create the opportunity, progress it, close it, check the dashboard, and then we'll go and clean up the test data. Each of these is a little self-contained task on its own, built up of building blocks. So we'll read an environment, so that comes back to making sure that tests are environment independent. So we run the same test, we can just read the parameters for different environments. We'll connect to the browser session that's tagged from the environment setup, and you can maintain or can run multiple instances of different browsers and switch between them. It'll basically allocate each one an ID, so you can use it to handle the personas. We'll navigate to sales accounts. This is a operation, and basically we say, okay, we're going to sales and we're going to the account screen there. Then we'll read from the Excel file, which has some basic account data in it. So we have an Orca test account and test sub account. We've got some details. For the sub account, we're setting parent account ID to point to the test account, and we've got some addresses in there. There's also details for the contact as well, and again, parent customer IDs pointing to the Orca test account for the demo. So that's some basic sort of abstracted test data. Essentially, this task just will loop through each row in the accounts, and then it will loop through, create a new record, and then it will loop through each field, call a function to set that a particular field name to a particular field value, clearing it first, and then we'll save the entity and loop through the next one. So I won't go into the detail of all of the tests, but what I'll do now is I should somewhere have a Chrome session already logged in. Excellent. So if I run this, I've put breakpoints, little blue dots. There's a full debugging sort of mechanism under you can step through and look at variables and so on, but I'm just using it to pause the test so we can talk about what's happened. So I will hit run and flip back to here, and we should see this now. I forgot that it was going to prompt me for the environment. So the demo gods sneezed at me, but hopefully they haven't broken anything yet. So we've got a number of demo environments we can run with. So this particular one, D365 demo. So I'll hit finish. There we go. Right, it's now driving. So it's gone back to the home page, and it's going to take us into Sales Hub. And it's basically waiting for the UI to come back. And now it will actually create, there we go. So we've gone to the accounts, my active accounts. It's clicking the new button. So I shall just put my hands behind my head so you believe me. And there's the test account coming from the data. And it's basically just iterating through the fields. Nothing particularly earth-shattering there, but it's showing reading the data from the data set that we've prepared beforehand, and it's saving it, and then just waiting for the UI. Because I mentioned the asynchronous processes, and then it's hit the new button again, and it's running through to put in the second account. And here we're using that dynamic pick list to pick in the Orca test account that we created first, acting as a user, making sure that works, and we'll put in the rest of the address data and save this account, and that's the second prospect account. And if you're thinking in terms of an end-to-end test, you could potentially have a link into the API to do an API call to check that the accounts were linked correctly and that they were created correctly. You could pull out the test data from the API and validate it against the original spreadsheet just to make sure it was the same. So we've now got a couple of accounts, and we've paused. So the next step, we're just going to go in and change the prospect to the customer, and we'll also set some of the communication preferences. So we're navigating, and we're changing the grid view and searching for the test account. And now it's flipped to the details, and it's going to set some profile information, and it will set some of the preferences because they prefer to deal with email, but not bulk email. And we toggled the fax. So it'll handle the different types of checkboxes there. If we go back to the summary, we can see that's now a customer. So it basically just acted as a user and switched from prospect to customer. And again, you can validate that with the API. And we can see our auto post there. So the next step is actually going to create the contact, and it will book a meeting at the same time. So we'll talk through that. Again, this is reusing components. It's reusing the navigation component, and it's reusing the command bar interaction to be able to click a button. So we can just say click delete, and if it's there, it'll click it. So it's picked the account, the main test account, onto this account, and it's setting some extra information that it's reading from the spreadsheet, and that's saving that. And then when the UIs come back, we've now hit the plus on the timeline, and it's popped up the quick create, and we're running through the fields on there just like any other form. And we're going to set it to a 90-minute call to give us plenty of time, and that auto translates into 1.5 hours. So that's actually an example of where you need to sort of realize how the data is working under the covers, because that let's pop it open. The 1.5 hours actually is really 90 under the covers. It's masking it. So you need to have an understanding of how the UI works with data to be able to build the tests, the automated tests properly. So the next step is, so we're reusing the navigation and search steps each time. So the next step, we're going to go and grab that meeting. So this time we'll navigate to the activities, which is where meetings live, and we'll switch to a view that can see it, and we'll search for it. And if you look in the top right at the search box when it comes up, you should be able to see it typing in a search and essentially hitting the search button. So let's trigger that. So that's now gone to my work activities. It's searched, it's popped up the form, and again it's just doing some basic edits. So we'll put some notes on the meeting, and we'll close it, and then it's going to go and flip to the closed activities and search for it and validate that it can find it. So we've actually got essentially an assert in the test there that if it doesn't find any records there, it would fail the test. So that's the basic sort of the first part of the flow up to, we've got an activity, we've closed the meeting activity, and actually we're going to bid. They've asked us to bid for I've used 2 million as a nice big number so we can see it in the pipeline. Oops. So the next step, we're going to create an opportunity, and then we'll progress the opportunity through the BPF. I've actually got another session logged in outside so we can have a look at what happens in the pipeline. So if we look at the pipeline, we've got currently about 9 million in qualify, 2 million in develop, 13 in propose, and nothing in closed. Now, actually, this brings back an interesting point. It's easy enough to grab these numbers using automation tools, but actually the whole dashboard, all of the graphs and so on are designed, they're kind of built under the covers, and the output is designed for human visual consumption, and it's actually quite hard to automate them in an abstracted way to be able to say, okay, for that graph, I want to find the funnel and I want to get the number for develop, because actually all of the numbers are just separate elements and they're not tagged with develop or whatever. They just happen to be positioned on by the engine. So yes, so we could actually grab the numbers and know that the first one is qualify and the last one is closed. But actually you want to think about having a person validate this dashboard and the way it looks and works, because actually it's designed for human consumption and it's designed as a visual representation. And that's something that obviously people major on. That's what it's for. So let me find the right session. So it's just back to our controlled one. We can see up the top it says Chrome is being controlled by auto test software. Now kick this off again. So this is just waiting. You can see we're just recording the tests that we've done. For example, under update and complete meeting, there's the different steps that I defined within it, and it's tagged them all as passed. So that's just giving a bit of an overview as we go. So if I run this now, this will now create an opportunity. So we flipped over to the opportunity screen, and now it's going to basically clicks new, And then it's going to put in some basic details. It'll pick the contact, it'll give it a name so we can find it later, and it'll pick in the contact and account. So again, this comes back to thinking through your test data, because you want to be able to pass the data through the system, say, okay, we're going to need to be able to find this opportunity later, so you need to track the names. That's why you need to think about the data holistically that you're going to be using for UI testing. And we popped in the estimated revenue up there in the header fields, again using the automation. So the reason I'm using, if I go back and look at the pipeline, we've still got 9 million there, but if I refresh it, we've now got 11 million there. And like I said, we could grab that number to confirm the sort of the test. The reason I'm using a separate session just to check this is because I'm sort of pausing the test in the middle. I don't want to confuse things, get the browser in a state that it shouldn't be. So the next step we're going to do is actually, great, we created this opportunity, but actually let's use the BPF to progress it and test that our flow works. Journey. I mean, obviously you'd realistically do this over multiple days, quite probably, but for the sake of the auto test, we're essentially checking that the BPF works and moves on to each step properly. Now we're ticking the fields and what have you and pressing the buttons, and then we're going to tag it as finished, and it's gone green. And now if we go back to the pipeline, we currently got 11 up the top and nothing down the bottom. And if I'd hit refresh all, that's gone back to 9. And we've now got a big chunk. We got the 2 million down the bottom. Like I said, again, you could grab that number and confirm that the number's changed, but you'd have to sort of think about, actually, is your environment fully clean first? Would you want to, do you just want to look for 2 million, or actually, do you want to capture what was that actually in that state in the first place, and then work out what it should be after you've pumped test data through it, and then essentially just add it up with your test tool and say what it should be at the end, and check that the right number's there. And you might need to sort of maybe put some tolerances in or something if you've got lots of decimals in some systems. Now at the moment we've got no data, showing no data available in the closed opportunities in the current fiscal year. So what we're going to do next, the last part of this process, is we'll close the opportunity. So that's now gone back to the opportunities. So it's searched for Orca opportunity, and it's going in here, and it will hit close as 1 in the tool in the command bar, and then we basically parameterize the dialog. So you sort of send it in a list of fields and values to populate, and it will press OK, and that's now actually closed. So now we want to say, okay, well, in theory, we should now have that in the closed state. So the last part of the real test is to check the dashboard, and that will actually go and check that there's an Orca test account entry in that bottom right chart. Which now is, so we've gone back to the dashboard, and essentially this is just a very simple little test. If I hop in there, that's passed. If I hop in there, F3 goes in. We've gone to the dashboard and we've checked. This one's a basic web operation that's part of the tool. So I've just said for the sake of this one, because like I said, the dashboards are so specific and heavily customizable. We're just basically looking for Orca test account under that 5th chart. And if it's not there, we would have reported an error. So actually, I could stop that here. Just looking at the time. Oh, I've got a few minutes. So if I stop this now, flow, and I could actually say, are we actually going to look for, if we were going to look for an account that doesn't exist in that grid, we could actually just run this test on the demo environment. Actually, there isn't anything there now, and it's failed. So this test step, check closed opportunities, has failed. and we can double click on that, and it's showing the error message. We set closed opportunity not on dashboard. So you know that's a break. And you could either have the whole flow stop at that point, or you could sort of wrap it in a try and highlight it, but carry on. Depends how critical it is and how the flow of the tests need to go. Do that change. And if we look at the last thing to do, I'll disable all of those bits because we don't want to run them again. The last part, we're going to clean up the test data. So at the moment, we've got our Orca accounts and we've got our contact, Adrian Richards here. And actually, we want to leave the environment nice and clean and put it back where we started. So if I run this last one, yeah, it's going to prompt the environment. Now, if we actually look at this, we'll go to the right one. Because I had the breakpoint on, it's instantly stopped. So if we go back here, that's going to go to the counts. It's going to search for the Orca test star, select them, and it will hit delete, and then it'll OK the dialog. And because of the way Dynamics works, we know that will flush out the contact and the activities and the opportunities. So actually, we've now got a clean system. Adrian's gone, and the opportunity will have gone too. So we're back to start. And if we refresh this, the numbers have all gone. No, that went well. That's the worst thing the demo gods do to me. I'm very happy. So we're back to the 9, 2, 13 and 0, and no in the pipeline funnel, and no data down here because the closed opportunity has been deleted. So that was essentially, I hope that sort of gave you a demonstration of some of the things you need to think about and why they're important when you're actually running a flow, a UI test automation flow end to end. So basically, I'd like to wrap up there and say thank you for listening. I've got my LinkedIn details on there if anyone wants to reach out. But I'm pretty much spot on for 3 o'clock, I think, Raz.
Yeah, you are indeed, James, and thanks again.
No, you're welcome.
Yeah, thanks for that great session.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, great. And so please share your contact details in the chat window, and so that people can get in touch with you. I'm sure obviously there was a lot covered there. And if you could also repeat the tool as well, I'm sure that would be helpful as well. Regarding any material, that would be helpful. But once again, thanks again to James Gillies. James, where are you based, by the way?
Me, at the moment, I'm sort of on the very edge of Luton, near the airport. I've spent the last 10 months working from home. Before that, I was basically smack in the middle of the city for quite some time.
Yeah. Got you. Well, listen, it was nice to obviously connect with you, and thanks again for sharing this great session today.
Thanks very much for the invitation and the opportunity. Good luck for the rest of the day. I shall stop.